services to us. Medrovus says we should be braced for more of this. We're getting some of these seeds going.
Mentre nella seconda metà calerà a livelli inferiori alla media, raggiungendo i 18-15 gradi. La temperatura minima continuerà ad essere
The evidence in the record now is becoming clearer and clearer. We no longer assume the temperature of the world is stable.
That carbon footprint is about 16 tons of carbon emissions.
What about COP26? What is COP?
The potential threats to the surrounding natural environment through the ocean. What the UN is calling the world's first climate change famine.
記録的な暑さだとか、あと危険な毎日
Scientists are correct in their fears and predictions.
Sign of climate change.
I'm sorry.
No, don't be sorry.
And that's because the more we take, the less there is for future generations.
On our warming planet, there are reasons for hope.
We need to have the courage to try.
Climate change is not the problem. Climate change is the expression of the problem.
Renewable energy technologies to fundamentally transform the energy system are at our disposal.
So how do we begin the process of reversing global warming?
People are starting to buy electric cars and
launched the largest tree plantation campaign.
It is now cheaper to build offshore wind farms.
To develop a climate-altering crop.
Continually reinvesting in our grasslands. We are looking down a critical moment that we cannot not be part of. Enormous opportunity in agriculture.
We can become stubborn optimists.
26 is one of the most important diplomatic gatherings in.
But humanity already knows what to do.
We can't do it overnight, but we can set that end date.
We've got a long way to go.
But there is momentum.
Roll up your sleeves and do it.
Crucial talks, urgent action, a climate emergency. That was the rhetoric before this week's much-awaited UN climate conference in Glasgow. Just 2 weeks after the UN said the Earth was on course for a devastating 2.7 degrees warming by the end of the century, will world leaders be willing to put aside their differences to agree to real change? Can they set new net zero goals? Can they set the world on course to stop catastrophic global warming? Or, as the activists gathered outside accuse the most powerful people in the world of playing the blah blah blame game, will the next 2 weeks end with an all too familiar platitudes and no real commitments? From COP26 in Glasgow, I'm Francine Lacqua, and welcome to this special episode of Bloomberg Green. Last week, nations representing more than 80% of global greenhouse emissions actually failed to make progress. The G20 meeting in Rome came to a close with no real update to 2015's Paris Climate Agreement. Countries agreed to halt new overseas coal projects, but actually made, crucially, no commitments to domestic investments. It left a lot to do here at COP26. Starting on Sunday, October 31st, more than 25,000 delegates representing 200 countries descended on Scotland's second city with a single goal in mind: progress. A process known as the ratcheting mechanism means that every 5 years at COP, parties are expected to enhance their green ambitions. So the UK's largest intergovernmental event since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic began with ambition. But familiar divides between the rich and poor nations threaten to undermine any new grand agreement on emissions.
We all must speed up our race to net zero. We're running out of time.
The United States is not only back at the table, but hopefully leading by the power of our example. My administration is working overtime to show that our climate commitment is action, not words.
France, but more broadly the European Union, as well as the United Kingdom, are today ready to meet their commitments.
India is the only big economy in the world that has delivered both in letter and spirit on its Paris commitments.
All those promises will be nothing but blah, 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 to coin a phrase. And the anger and the impatience of the world will be uncontainable unless we make this COP26 in Glasgow the moment when we get real about climate change.
This meant that it would come down to individual countries updating their NDCs, or nationally determined contributions, to show movement in the right direction. And that brought two of the biggest surprises at COP26 so far. Even without the president, Jair Bolsonaro, Brazil committed to a net zero target by 2050. And India's Narendra Modi finally put a timeline on his own pledge to hit net zero, though the goal is 20 years later than many had hoped. Meanwhile, China, whose presence here has been limited, stuck to its 2060 outline. Two other agreements provided reason for optimism as leaders cleared out Glasgow and allowed their negotiators to get to work. The US and European Union's much-anticipated pledge to cut methane emissions got support from more than 90 countries, though super polluters China and Russia held out. Plus, the UK led a declaration from more than 100 countries to halt and reverse deforestation by 2030. Unlike previous plans, the one announced this Tuesday was backed by Brazil, home to 60% of the Amazon rainforest, and Russia, home to the world's largest expanse of temperate forests. It also came with $19 billion of commitments from both governments and companies.
We have to stop the devastating loss of our forests, these great teeming ecosystems, trillion-pillared cathedrals of nature, 3 trillion-pillared cathedrals of nature that are the lungs of our planet.
Finance is also playing its role at the conference as a supporter and facilitator. Mark Carney presented a scorecard for the finance industry on Wednesday, and Bank of America's Brian Moynihan backed unilateral action from corporates on a green transition. We'll hear more from our conversation with both of them later on. But now, let's talk the big questions. What will it take to get countries to agree, one up the Paris Agreement, and limit global warming to 1.5 degrees?
This isn't just something we have to do to protect the environment and our future. It's an enormous opportunity for all of us, all of our nations, to create jobs and make meeting climate goals a core part of our global economic recovery as well.
We've been speaking to European leaders about that very topic.
It will work only if all the world, if all the countries, if the private companies, if we are all in the same boat, following the same direction.
What we see is fires that are becoming much more intense and much more difficult to contain. We know this is a direct consequence of climate change. We know we need to do more to manage our forests better. And of course, as a European Union, I think we need to do more to strengthen overall our civil protection.
I am more optimistic about the Rome outcome in the sense that for the first time in many G20s, we were able to come to conclusions collectively. I am cautiously optimistic that we can get somewhere in the next 2 weeks.
But it's not just leaders of Western countries. In order to make COP a success, leaders from emerging economies also have to get on board. Well, we've been speaking to the president of Costa Rica, Carlos Alvarado Quezada, who says the targets given by developed nations don't go far enough.
There's the discussion of the developing countries are too risky. But here, the only risk I see is that if we don't act, there won't be any planet anymore. So I don't see any risk higher than that one. Risk is a matter of, it's measured also in time and framing.
So do you feel cheated by some of the top emitters? I mean, they also come from the developed world.
I wouldn't use that word. I think we need to go further in our commitments.
Coming up on the agenda at COP, finance. Firms representing $130 trillion worth of assets sign up to net zero pledges. We'll talk finance's lofty climate goals at COP26 and hear from Mark Carney, Brian Moynihan, and Rishi Sunak. That's next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Bloomberg Green. I'm Francine Lacqua here in Glasgow for the COP26 summit. Now, banks and asset managers representing 40% of the world's financial assets have now pledged to meet the goals set out in the Paris Climate Agreement. More than 450 firms representing $130 trillion of assets now belong to the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, almost double the roughly $70 trillion at the time of its April launch. For Mark Carney, who chairs the organization, the announcement marks a milestone after he managed to get some of the world's biggest asset managers and financial firms to sign up. We spoke to Mark Carney about the importance of finance coming together on the issue.
I'm going to quote the Secretary General's hopes unfulfilled but not yet buried. The 1.5 degrees anchor in the G20 communique is significant. Some progress, but we've got a lot of work to do. The big question for this week, at least for this Wednesday, is what can finance, and more specifically the private financial sector, what can it do to help solve this problem? So it's going to really have to step up, and there's been a lot of institutions, a lot of people around the world who've been working in order to do that.
Yeah, we don't even have a price on carbon yet. When will we get that?
Well, we don't have a price on carbon, but what I think our message on Wednesday to world leaders, to policymakers, to business people around the world is finance is going to be there, and finance is going to be there in two respects. One, we've retooled the financial system. We've changed the plumbing, if you will, the financial system, a bunch of very worthy reforms that actually, to be honest, only the audience of Bloomberg would fully understand and appreciate, and we can go through them for the next hour. But, think mandatory disclosure, think stress testing, all that. So part of it is retooling, but then it's also about financial institutions stepping up and saying that they are going to finance this transition, this enormous $100 trillion transition that needs to happen over the next 3 decades. They're going to finance it, and they're going to mark their own homework. They're going to show up year in, year out, say what their emissions are of their clients, have specific strategies for reducing carbon, fair share of 50% down by 2030. That's what the Glasgow Financial Alliance is all about.
Former Bank of England Governor Mark Carney there, currently serving at the UN as a climate finance envoy. Now, climate finance is also clearly a big issue for the big banks. I spoke to the Bank of America Chief Executive Brian Moynihan about what kind of pressure his industry is under to deliver on their green goals.
This is a transition, a just transition we all have to make as a consumer, as a company, your company, and everything you do, everything goes on around. And so there's a lot of pressure on banks because our clients are demanding this. Our investors are demanding this. The politicians, the world's demanding this. And so if you think about it in the context of the SDGs, in 2015, the United Nations, all the countries said, we want this to happen, sustainable development. And now we've got to implement it.
But when you look at some of what Wall Street and banks in general can do, could you stop lending to businesses that pollute too much?
Well, that's the great debate. But to help everybody make a transition, all our clients have to make a transition. Some of them extract minerals, some extract fossil fuels, and they're all making those commitments. And our job as a financial institution is to assess them on a risk basis, honestly. Here's my plan. Here's where I'm going to go. And that's hard for them. I mean, it's easy for a services firm to say I'm going to be net zero, but it's hard for them. And then we got to stay with them to help make that transition because they need capital to deploy. And so their plans, their declarations, and you're seeing it by many of them now, saying we're going to do this by this year, then we can be part of the measurement system, because as we underwrite them, one of the risks we're underwriting is, do they have a plan that meets the standards that the world wants them to have? And if they don't, they're going to have a problem financially down the road, and that's how we do it.
So where's the biggest opportunity for banks?
Well, we did $80 billion of financing last year, and it's a business. And so, we have tax credits. We disclose in our 10Q the difference between our rate and our paid rate is all for wind, solar, and low and moderate income housing. It's $1 billion a quarter in tax credits. That's how big a business do. So there's lots of opportunity to make money doing this. And then we'll need concessional capital, and we do that too with some of the work we do and more of the charitable work and everything in between. But the thing that's hard for people to understand is this transition happens when we all work together to make it happen, and that's what's fun about this.
Are you disappointed that we don't have more commitments?
No, the governments can work a lot of ways. Simple mandates, simple enablement, permitting faster. There's a lot of things to do, and I think they're seeing, as the private sector is pushing them, before they were pushing the private sector more, you have to disclose your scope 1, 2, 3, and the informal, the NGO type of disclosure and the government disclosure. Now we're pushing them, saying, okay, we'll do that, but really we need you to enable it. So the multilateral development banks, take the political risk away, take some of the duration risk, take some of the currency risk, and you can unlock all this capital.
Bank of America Chief Executive Brian Moynihan. Now, as the world's focus turns to finance and the climate fight, we spoke to the UK Chancellor Rishi Sunak. Sunak says he intends to make Britain the world's first net zero finance centre.
I think it is really important that we take a moment to step back and look what's been achieved today. And you talked about this alliance, G-Fans as it's called, which is not the name of a Korean pop band, but it's been assembled 450 different firms that, as you said, represent $130 trillion of capital that can be deployed towards net zero. That's an enormous achievement, because we know that public funding is not sufficient on its own. That wall of capital can now be deployed towards net zero aims, helping developing countries. But of course this is going to be a process. We need to make sure that the governance works, it's high quality, and that what sits there on a piece of paper is actually going to turn into tangible, actionable projects on the ground that are going to make a difference to people's lives.
Chancellor, you're cutting the aid budget overall, but actually sticking to your pledge on climate aid. So what will miss out?
Well, actually, on our aid budget, what I said last week is on the basis of our fiscal and economic forecast that we put out, we are scheduled and forecast to return back to 0.7% of our GDP being spent on overseas aid by 2024. It's also worth bearing in mind that even at the level we're at now, we are still the third or fourth highest in the G7, so far more than many other countries, and significantly ahead of the OECD average. So although there's been a lot of focus on our slight change, I think the vast majority of people actually spend less as a percentage of their GDP supporting overseas development than the UK does, and obviously historically we've been at a very high level. And as you see, we can lead in other ways as well. You mentioned climate finance, but as chairs or presidents of the G7 this year, one of the things we've been determined to do is green the overall financial system. And we've been talking a lot about that today. How do we make sure that disclosure requirements, climate risk reporting is all being embedded mainstream in financial, the financial system to unlock that capital?
Coming up, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi surprised delegates with a bold pledge. The world's third biggest emitter will reach net zero by 2070. We'll break down the details. That's next. And this is Bloomberg Green. Welcome back to Bloomberg Green. I'm Francine Lacqua here in Glasgow for the COP26 summit. India, the world's third biggest emitter, has traditionally been resistant to setting a deadline for net zero. That is, until now. The Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, stunned delegates with a promise to take his country to carbon neutrality by 2070. Now, the target is 20 years later than many richer countries, but India has been making strong progress on its climate goals, while reporter Archana Chaudhary has the details.
India has been highlighting how it is the only G20 nation which has met its commitments that were made in 2015 during the Paris meetings. And in the last 20 years, India has invested heavily in adding renewable energy capacity, whether it is wind or whether it is solar. More importantly, we've seen in the last few months, India has been announcing policies like its national hydrogen mission. It has been expanding partnerships with US and with UK on solar as well as technologies for renewables and raising finances. So it has been creating the ecosystem that is required to go towards this goal. India is the world's third biggest emitter because of its choice in fuels. Its economy is heavily dependent on fossil fuels, and coal remains India's go-to fuel for electricity generation. And for this to change, indeed, the entire Indian economy is going to require an overhaul. Its industrial systems are going to need a change, and more importantly, India will need to change the mindset of its people as well as its industries. The even bigger challenge will be availability of finances to make this transition possible. So India will have to deal with this stumbling block, as well as making possible the technologies that it will need to move to a net zero economy. India has been investing heavily in renewable capacities in the last 20 years. And so it already has in place policies that enable people to invest, companies to invest in this sector. We also know that India's richest billionaires, Mukesh Ambani as well as Gautam Adani, are looking at large investments in solar capacities as well as in hydrogen technologies. And India has been working with its international partners. John Kerry was here in September, where they signed an agreement for for making finances available for renewable energy. So we know that India is working on this, but whether it will be able to make the financial backing available in time for this kind of a transition, that is a challenge that we will need to see how they meet.
Our reporter there, Archana Chaudhary in New Delhi. Now, we've also been speaking with India's Environment Secretary. Here's what he said.
We are expecting our emissions to peak somewhere around between 2040 and 45. And after that, we will be reducing the emissions and reaching the net zero.
Now, for more, let's also bring in our climate reporter, Akshat Rathi, on the ground with me in Glasgow. Akshat, thank you for joining us. This was a massive welcome. It really reinvigorated the talks, the fact that India decided Glasgow COP26 to make a pledge.
Absolutely. And you're right, like 20 years later than what most of the rich countries are aiming for. So net zero by 2050. But we should recognize that what the science says is that rich countries have to go sooner. And so it is no surprise that the US and the EU and Japan have a goal to reach net zero by 2050. Germany has it for 2045. And it is no surprise that India has it later, and so does China, which is going for 2060.
So actually, when you speak to scientists, 2070 still keeps the temperature at that 1.5 degree crucial level.
Yes, so the way to think about it is carbon dioxide is only 75% of the warming property. The 25% is all other greenhouse gases, nitrous oxide, methane, etc. And what scientists say is that you need to get to net zero carbon dioxide by 2050, and then net zero all greenhouse gases by 2070. So India's goal that way is actually going to keep the world aligned on 1.5 degrees Celsius.
Akshat, thank you so much. Our climate reporter there, Akshat Rathi, with as always, really some great reporting. So will COP26 actually be considered a success? It's certainly having a positive impact on climate ambition. Announcements at Glasgow mean that countries responsible for 89% of the world's emissions now have a net zero target fixed or under discussion. This contrasts with 53% of the day before the summit began and just 10% in January 2020. We got deals on methane, deforestation, and as we just heard, the world's third largest emitter finally committed to a roadmap for net zero. Talks continue, though. We'll be back next week with more on COP26. Keep the conversation going. Follow us on YouTube, Instagram, and Twitter at Climate. From Glasgow, I'm Francine Lacqua, and this is Bloomberg Green.